We are on a responsible fiscal path.
On the program, the Canadian economy sees a surprise surge in job creation, but the news heightens worries about inflation and virtually guarantees more interest rate hikes. We'll hear from two economists. Saskatchewan's Justice Minister talks about legislation to change that province's constitution and fight what she calls Ottawa's harmful economic policies.
If that was happening in your community, in your front lawn, would that be okay with you?
I'd probably join in, yes.
And our journalist panel weighs in on the latest at the Emergencies Act inquiry and Krista Freeland's economic update. But we start with the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister, Krista Freeland, in Toronto on Friday, talking up the measures in Thursday's economic update.
We are on a responsible fiscal path. We are in strong positions to be able to help Canadians now, to help them if we need more help in the coming months, and with investments in things like clean hydrogen and more clean tech, build opportunities long into the future that will keep us as one of the highest rated economies in the world.
Statistics Canada has just released the latest unemployment figures for October, and they show a jump in job creation, 108,000 new jobs in October, 10 times what many economists had expected. But ironically, the good news is fueling fears that the economy is overheating, that inflation has become entrenched, and that, as most observers say, Canada is heading into a recession. To look at it all, I'm joined by Pedro Antunes. He is the chief economist at the Conference Board of Canada, and Jim Stanford, who is an economist and the director of the Centre for the Future of Work. Both of you, thanks for joining me.
Thank you, Martin.
Welcome.
Okay, let's start with it. I mean, I think a lot of Canadians are trying to get their head around the fact that we have historically low unemployment figures, including this surge in unemployment creation this month, and yet it spells potentially bad news in terms of inflation and higher interest rates. Pedro Antunes, start us out by explaining to the average Canadian what that means.
Yeah, well, essentially what we're facing, I think, is very much a supply-constrained economy. You know, we keep hearing from the bank and from federal finance as well, the Bank of Canada, that is, that we're above capacity. And when we say that, I really think we're above capacity in terms of the labor market. If you talk to many employers in Canada today, they're desperately looking for workers because they can't satisfy the demand that's out there for their product. So I don't think it's bad news necessarily that we've seen job creation. Yeah. But what I'm suggesting is that a very tight labor market with the unemployment rate in Canada at record lows, that is a sign that essentially we can start to see inflationary pressures come up. And it's not so much that we don't want to see wages catch up with inflation, and that is happening. In fact, in some provinces, wages have outpaced inflation. That's not necessarily bad news on its own. The problem is if those wage increases aren't reflected in productivity, then they just end up, with another round of price increases from employers, and we end up back into the 1980s with a spiral of inflation. So this is the challenge that I think monetary authorities are facing today.
Okay, Jim Stanford, what do you make of it? I mean, the suggestion is that this very, very low unemployment rates are going to fuel the central bank's intent to continue to hike inflation rates. And we're seeing the result that we're heading into a recession caused by the monetary policy.
Well, at least the good news, Martin, today was that recession clearly hasn't started yet.
Yeah.
And I was worried that it had. But wow, 100,000 new jobs is a sign that we've still got some momentum. And I am still of the old school that the more people are out there working, producing, generating income, paying taxes, that is good news. And the only reason people think it's bad news is because we've somehow been sucked into this upside down idea that Canadians have too much work. This is the underlying assumption of the Bank of Canada's argument that the labor market is overheated. I absolutely reject that. We still have 5.2% unemployment. That's about where it was in 2019 before the pandemic, and we didn't have a wage price spiral in 2019. Wages are growing in nominal terms at around 5%. It's a little bit less than that when you adjust for quality and composition, more like 4%. And that is still way behind consumer price inflation. So real wages, the actual cost of labor in economic terms, is falling, not rising. So all of this suggests we've still got room to grow. It's only someone who's unduly focused on wages and workers as the source of inflation, which I don't think describes what's happened, who could see this possibly as bad news.
Okay, well then a question though, in a word to both of you and each of you, the Bank of Canada Governor, Tiff Macklem, has said that he counts on, plural, more interest rate hikes coming up. Are we headed inevitably, though, to a recession? Pedro Antunes.
Well, I think, if you look at most of the forecasts that are out there right now, they're essentially calling for a very similar scenario, whether they define it as a recession or not. What we're looking at for most forecasters, including, what the Bank of Canada put out just recently and what we saw from the economic update yesterday, it's essentially flat growth for 2 or 3 quarters. Some forecasters have a couple of minor declines in there. That means technical recession for some. Okay. In my view, these aren't recessions. These are essentially the successful monetary policy scenario where for all of those forecasts, what you see is the economy slows down, inflation starts to come down, and by the time we get to 2024, and by the way, that includes our own forecast at the conference board, but by the time we get to 2024, inflation is back in check in that 2 to 3% range. I think the risk, however, is that we do see inflationary pressures continue, and that could be internal. I certainly see Jim's point, but I do think that if wages continue to catch up with inflation, we will get into this spiral where it's very hard to beat back domestic inflationary pressures. But that's one issue. Of course, there's the geopolitics too, and we could very easily end up with another round of commodity price shocks here. So any of these things could trigger a tougher stance or a tougher time for monetary authorities to bring down inflation. Higher interest rates. We're extremely leveraged in this country, lots of debt for households, and that could spell a much harder landing, I think, further down the road.
Okay, Jim Stanford, rightly or wrongly, in terms of the Bank of Canada's hiking of interest rates, do you think we are inevitably headed for a recession, if you want to call it that or not? And I'd like to get your reflections on what was in the economic update and whether the measures, for example, for giving student interest on loans and this expansion of the workers' benefit, the Canada workers' benefit, whether they will come as any help. Are we going to be in a recession, in a word? And the measures we saw in the economic update?
We will be in a recession next year. I'm surprised by today's news and gladdened by it, but the overall trend is still very negative, not just from our own interest rates, but from those around the world and the other adjustments from the pandemic and the shock. So I think that is a given. In terms of the fiscal and economic statement, it was, I think, quite cautious and quite conservative. There is this idea that the government is still throwing money around because they have a deficit. Not so. In fact, program spending from the government has fallen very sharply over the last 2 years, including in the current fiscal year, and future increases are not even going to keep up with population growth and inflation. So the measures that were there, that workers' benefit, for example, for low-income workers, good ideas, targeted, but I think we're going to need more of that if and when the economy does go into a recession. Okay,
Pedro Antunes, we only have a few seconds left. Your reaction to the measures that were announced by Minister Freeland yesterday, specifically those targeted measures on student loans, on workers' benefits, and on those two major points.
Yeah, no, I would agree. We are trying to ease the pain on those that suffer most from inflation, and I think those measures were targeted and relatively light. So not adding to that problem that the Bank of Canada is trying to fight. Too much stimulus or too much fervor in the economy, if you'd like. I'd also like to point out that there was what I would suggest very few measures in terms of stimulating the other part of the economy, which is private investment, and I think we need to do more on that front as well.
Okay, both of you, thank you very much. We will no doubt have a chance to speak again as we monitor this and as we watch the trends. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Mark.
Well, speaking of the economy, a word about a labour dispute in Ontario. On Friday, an estimated 55,000 education workers went out on strike, closing hundreds of schools around the province. At issue is wages. Their union says the average salary of the educational assistants is $39,000 a year. Their legal strike was declared illegal by legislation passed this week by Premier Doug Ford's government. He has also invoked the Constitution's notwithstanding clause to protect the legislation from a court challenge. The Ford government argues that Ontario parents should not have their children's school interrupted by the job action, and it says the exceptional back-to-work legislation, it says, is justified. Canada's federal, provincial and territorial health ministers are meeting in Vancouver this weekend. Their much-anticipated meeting comes as healthcare systems across the country are in what's commonly referred to as a crisis, especially faced with acute staffing shortages and burnout. For several years now, the premiers have been calling for a First Minister's Summit with the Prime Minister to discuss increased transfer payments, and their calls haven't been answered. Instead, it will be up to the health ministers this weekend to talk. Joining me now is Stephen Staples. He's the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the Canadian Health Coalition. Stephen Staples, thanks for joining us.
Hi, Martin.
I set the scene a bit. I mean, we have had many years of promised meetings of the first ministers, and we're still awaiting that. What are you expecting this weekend out of the health ministers meeting?
Not very much, I'm afraid. This is a really low-key meeting. There has not been a lot of attention focused on it. It's not a meeting of the premiers like we saw last summer. It's a meeting of the health ministers. But we're looking for any sign that there's a thawing or any conversation between the federal government and the provincial governments to move forward on some of the critical issues that are facing our healthcare system right now. But at this point, it looks like, despite some ads being run by the premiers calling for more money from the federal government, it's going straight to voicemail. The answer is the same, not much happening.
So you don't have any great expectations for this particular meeting at a ministerial level?
I don't think so. I don't expect a lot of change coming from the standoff that we've seen. The provinces seem intent on calling for more federal transfers to cover healthcare costs. The federal government has not been signaling that they're prepared to do it. We just had a fiscal update that had very little in it in terms of attention to healthcare. The problem is the federal government wants to see some outcomes. They want to know where the money is going to go. And the province's answer has just been, butt out, write us the check, and we'll decide how to spend it. And that's the nub of the problem.
Okay, well, that brings up then something that's been much talked about since last week. The week before, Friday before last week, there was a leak to Toronto Star journalist, columnist Althea Raj. The leak from federal sources was suggesting that Ottawa might be ready to deal separately with the provinces. This is something that the premiers see as a divide and conquer strategy, but it was exactly what was done in 2016 with Justin Trudeau, Bill Morneau, and Jane Philpott when she was health minister. Do you think that's where we're going, that this is going to be an impasse, and B, it'll only be broken when the federal government starts to deal with one province at a time?
Well, it very well could be. They're definitely looking for some kind of strategy. I think the days of big health accords may be behind us. The future could be bilateral discussions like we saw in childcare with the federal government going from province to province to make deals. There's another possibility, too. The dental benefit that was negotiated at the behest of the NDP is that program is going ahead without the provinces at all. That's just going to be a federal insurance program to cover for dental care. Now, coming down the pike, Martin, is pharmacare. That's also promised under the deal. That's going to be tougher to do without cooperation from the provinces. But what we're hearing is there are some provinces that are probably willing to go ahead with a new pharmacare program. Mm-hmm. Others are not. So the federal government could be setting the stage for individual negotiations with those provinces that are willing to put some strings attached to the funding and deliver better outcomes and programs for Canadians.
Okay, Stephen Staples, thank you very much. We will keep in contact and we will watch this, obviously, on a topic which is so important and so close to most Canadians' hearts. Thanks a lot.
Nice to be here.
This week, the Saskatchewan government introduced the Saskatchewan First Act. That's legislation aimed at changing the province's constitution and, according to the government, protecting the province's economy from harmful federal policies. Justice Minister Bronwyn Eyre tabled the legislation, and she joins me now from Regina. First of all, Minister Eyre, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
Now, the question is succinctly, because this can get quite complex, but succinctly and concretely, what would the Saskatchewan First Act do?
Well, we are unilaterally amending our provincial constitution as we are able to do under Section 45 of the Constitution Act, and thereby asserting exclusive jurisdiction under 92A of the Constitution over natural resources and that which is exclusive jurisdiction. And bear in mind, this is not an amendment to the federal Constitution. It's an amendment to the Constitution Act 1867, the provincial part of that, and our own Saskatchewan Constitution.
Okay, now since your announcement, I've been looking at some of the reaction from constitutional scholars, and they've been saying that, and you mention it, these powers, for example, over non-renewable resources, their development and exploitation, electricity generation, regulation of provincial industries, you just mentioned, they're specifically spelled out in Section 92 and 93 of the Canadian Constitution. Why do you need this act?
We need it to assert and embed within the provincial constitution, the core powers, and that is a legal constitutional term, the core powers, the interjurisdictional immunity, another constitutional term, of those exclusive powers, exclusive, and that was a term that was not lightly arrived on, exclusive powers under Section 92. They exist already, but the infringements that we are seeing over and over by the federal government into exclusively provincial jurisdiction has increased certainly over the last number of years, and we feel that it has constitutional weight to amend the provincial constitution. That's not done lightly and is really very, very rare. And we feel that in stipulating interjurisdictional immunity, in stipulating and enumerating core powers, and really in trumpeting to the country and to the federal government and to the courts that there are exclusive federal powers and there are exclusive provincial powers is important.
To be concrete, I mean, let's look at you. I mean, you were energy minister, I believe, when Saskatchewan, when your government was party to the court case that went all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada, and that was about the government's carbon pricing scheme. The Supreme Court made very quick work of that and said the Trudeau government had federal jurisdiction over the environment and protection of the environment. Would something like this in any way change that ruling from the Supreme Court of Canada?
Sorry to interrupt. I was going to say in that case, of course, and you're right, that was dealt with, but it was dealt with through peace, order, and good government, or POG, which really was a federal trump card on provincial jurisdiction. We've also seen, however, with the Bill C-69 case in Alberta, that the wording and the holding by the Court of Appeal there was that the federal government had taken a quote-unquote wrecking ball to exclusive jurisdiction under 92A. So this is by no means resolved. POG was, as I say, a nuclear option, but the jurisdictional issue about federal and provincial jurisdiction is very much laid out in the Constitution, and we feel that it is important to formally amend and embed it in ours.
So that begs the big question then. The bottom line is, you're saying that you think that this might give you a better chance in both cases like that, like Bill 69 and the carbon pricing. Do you think then, does this lay the way for trying to re-litigate any of that legislation? Can you and would you?
Well, everything is on the table. I mean, we have a number, it's not only the carbon tax. I mean, let's keep in mind, we have a number of existentially harmful federal pieces of legislation, proposed legislation, regulation coming down the line. The clean electricity regulations, no fossil fuel generated power by 2035. That would effectively turn off the lights in Saskatchewan. SaskPower has said it is literally impossible to transition that quickly. The Queen Elizabeth Power Station just down the road here in Saskatoon powers the city with natural gas. So that is an existential problem and an economic harm. The federal fuel standard, $700 million a year for diesel consumption, gas consumption, the province of Saskatchewan, set to come into play next year. Carbon tax number 2, again, retail sector, rail, ag, naturally just fueling your car and power and gassing up your home. There are massive issues with that legislation. So we really see, you have to see this from Saskatchewan's perspective against a backdrop of cumulative economic harm and potential economic harm in the future. And that is why in the bill, we are putting in place an independent economic tribunal which will quantify the dollars and cents of these policies. And potentially then the idea could be that we could use that evidence as admissible. Or, for example, in the case of a reference to the Court of Appeal, an interlocutory injunction, it needs, one of the tests for an interlocutory injunction is irreparable harm. And that's why we feel that it is important to quantify and define and assess the economic harm of some of these policies on Saskatchewan. And keep in mind, this is economic harm that's being perpetrated on just one region of the country.
All right. Well, Minister Eyre, we will watch this with great interest. I want to thank you for speaking with us today.
You're welcome. Thank you so much.
Joining me now to look at the week in federal politics are two members of the Parliamentary Press Gallery, Ian Bailey of the Globe and Mail and Tonda MacCharles of the Toronto Star. First of all, both of you, thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
Hi, Martin.
Now, Tonda, you are at the site of the inquiry, the Emergencies Act inquiry, and we're going to get to that subject first in a minute. But first, let's talk about the economy, which is very much on everyone's mind, a looming recession. I want to start with the economic update from Chrystia Freeland. Ian, you were at the lockup. You've been watching it in detail. What stood out for you in her update and in the economy in general?
Well, I was struck by Minister Freeland kind of acknowledging tough times ahead, economic challenges looming, and the government sort of weighing in and doing its best to provide some assistance. Clearly, inflation is a key topic these days. It's a political challenge for the government. The new Conservative leader and the NDP leader are pushing the government very hard on this. And so the minister had some measures on federal student and apprentice loans, and other measures to sort of help Canadians. Not a lot, but some measures. But she was very candid about the challenges that Canada faces. She held out the possibility of eventual return to a surplus. And this statement struck me as kind of a bridge to give the government something defensive, something to talk about on the inflation file, pending a budget, obviously, next year. So those were a few of the things that came out and struck me in it. Okay,
quick question on that. Is on that same note. You mentioned that she acknowledged that the things could potentially get much worse. We're talking about the possibility of a recession. Ian, just to dwell on that, how much do you think that this whole exercise could be quite outdated by what could happen in the next 9 months, which is what the Bank of Canada is predicting in terms of no growth?
Well, this buys the government time for now, and it's, as the minister said, it's hard to predict how things are going to play out, how things are going to turn. So we'll have to see how this rolls out. But for now, I guess this gives the government buys them some time, depending how things turn out in the coming months. Okay,
Tonda, watching the economic update and the economic indicators that we've been watching, what do you make of it all?
Well, look, I think the political pivot in the messaging of the government is interesting, right? They're really, I think, trying to make Canadians to get ready for a much more difficult period ahead. And that's not, no government likes to talk about bad times ahead, and they always like to downplay that. She's not Mary Poppins. I mean, the spoonful of sugar that went with that medicine yesterday wasn't a whole lot. It was very targeted relief. But I was also interested overall in the fact that this government is trying somehow to sort of kickstart Canadian companies and the economy here in terms of that green transition, and also to try and up its competitiveness with American companies and the American fiscal picture. It seems that they're really feeling the heat and the pressure south of the border for the Canadian economy and the ability of our industries to compete with all the incentives that are being brought south of the border.
Okay. And now, Tonda, I mentioned you were at the site of the inquiry, the Emergencies Act inquiry. All week long we have been hearing, well, most of the week we've been hearing from key organizers and spokespersons of the occupation of downtown Ottawa. What stands out for you in the testimony we've been watching this week?
Well, a few things. We've heard all week long about the factions and the divisions and the power struggles within various groups at the convoy. That was underlined over and over again, in a way to downplay that this was some kind of monolithic group that could have been negotiated with. But also, on the convoy side, for them to promote it as an organic, peaceful, peace-loving event that didn't harm anybody, and that was really, whatever harms Ottawa experienced were exaggerated. divided. So that stood out for me. What also really is standing out for me, though, now after almost a week of this, well, I guess we have, you know, still a long day ahead of testimony, but in this, because I'm speaking to you just before that, I think what stands out is also the leeway that the judge and the inquiry and the commission counsel are giving the convoy organizers and participants. Leeway that was not given to Ottawa residents and businesses, nor really to police. None of the evidence was led on, or very little of that evidence was led at this inquiry. And there's a lot of space being given to the convoy participants to talk about their perspective on events. We have learned, to a certain extent, a little bit more about the challenge police negotiators faced in dealing with those divided factions. But I'm not sure how much more we've learned about the necessity of the Emergencies Act being invoked.
Okay, Ian, you covered, and we all lived through the occupation of downtown Ottawa, and you've been seeing some of this this testimony from organizers and protesters. On to Tonda's point too, we also today on Friday saw a lot of video played in sort of a counterpart to what the organizers were saying. They played a lot of video showing the kind of noise and disruption in the streets of Ottawa. What are you making of what you've been seeing this week?
Well, you know, I think that for many Canadians, or some Canadians anyway, what happened in Ottawa may seem very far away or very distant from them. What struck me in this phase of the inquiry, and I think we're a long way from the sort of conclusion about whether the Emergencies Act was justified. We're a long way, or maybe not a long way, but I think when the ministers and the Prime Minister testifies, maybe the tone of the inquiry will change. But what strikes me is that there are lessons here, I think, for Canadians across the country in challenges police face dealing with these kinds of incidents, challenges managing these kinds of incidents. There are obviously concerning disclosures about allegations of police assisting protesters and such. I think there's a lot for Canadians to learn. I mean, there could be incidents, not necessarily exactly like this, but other similar public disorder incidents in other Canadian cities. And I think that what we've heard this week and what we're hearing is very concerning. It's something for all Canadians to take note of, because these kinds of incidents could occur elsewhere in Canada.
Okay, Tonda, last in 30 seconds, what are you watching for in the weeks to come? Obviously, things will change. We'll have a different set of testimonies starting next week.
I think that the inquiry is now going to turn its mind to what was going on at the Windsor Ambassador Bridge, what was going on in Toronto at Queen's Park, what was going on in Coutts, Alberta. We'll hear evidence about how the solidarity actions and protests were unfolding in other areas across the country, the challenge it posed to authorities there, what they learned from the Ottawa handling or mishandling of the protest here. And that'll all come sort of heading into a discussion around what the Ontario provincial government officials thought and saw and what they did in response, and whether, and then, you know, eventually, I guess in a few weeks, we'll get to the picture, the federal picture, and what was going on in the minds of cabinet ministers at the time.
It all wraps up in the last week, we've been told, with the federal ministers and the Prime Minister. Listen, both of you, thank you very much for taking the time, and have a good weekend.
Same to you.
Thanks, Martin.
Well, that's it for this edition of Primetime Politics. I'm Martin Stringer. Thanks for watching, and on behalf of all of us here at CPAC, have a great weekend.